First, I'd like Malachi would like to make an announcement.
Welcome everybody to Wellington College. This program was put on by the Foreign Club, and for the students that are here, as we said, it's called Peace Process, Real or Phony. Mr. Mark Bruzonsky will be talking about the program, and for the students that are here, at the end I have the wellness sheet, so if you need the wellness credit, I'll be back there. Please come and you sign. The president of the club will introduce our speaker. Thanks.
And I think that gives you credit too, doesn't it, Malachi? When they sign the slips? Okay. Pardon me? I know, he's smarter than I am. Everybody. Let me start out by saying I've been with Mark half the day and it's been fun. He's a very dynamic person. I'll tell you just enough about him because I don't want to spend a lot of time. We want to hear what he has to say. He graduated from Lawrence University in Wisconsin in 1969. When he graduated, he was awarded a fellowship, which he took advantage of and got his law degree at NYU. He followed that up with a degree in international affairs at Princeton. So he tends to be a very well-read, intelligent person, a scholar, which I think we all can appreciate. During the last 15 or 20 years, he's made over 150 trips to the part of the world we call the Mideast. He has been consultant to any number of countries there, just to name a few: Saudi Arabia, the PLO, and Libya. He's rubbed elbows with people who, some of which are deceased, such as Anwar Sadat, Yitzhak Rabin, but I would not rub elbows with the lad, and Yasser Arafat. So he's spoken to princes and kings and so forth. He holds dual advanced degrees, as I said, in international affairs and law. And from 1977 through 84, he was the Washington representative of the World Jewish Congress. He's been a consultant on the Middle East for a number of organizations, and he's the author of several publications on the Mideast, Israel, and U.S. policy. His message, well, he'll tell you it's not all that, he's not here to entertain, but off the record, he has a great sense of humor, and better late than never. So it's with a great deal of appreciation, respect, and so forth, Mark Bruzonsky.
Well, Mike, thank you very much. And I hope you can hear me. The mics are close enough? No. Okay, I'll try to speak a little louder. We've been on the go all day. If at some point my voice trails off, will you just raise your hands and back and I'll... Well, it's good to be with you this evening. And the real thanks go to Marilyn Ridley and her husband, and to you, Mike. I wish I could be entertaining. We all like to be entertained, we all like to hear jokes, we all like to feel good about things, but unfortunately the subject you asked me to come and discuss is a pretty serious subject, and I don't have any jokes to tell. I'm not very optimistic, but I will try to be informative, and I suspect for at least some of you I'll probably also be rather provocative. And I say provocative because I know that the differences between what many Americans have come to think about the Middle East, and they've come to think about the Middle East based on limited and biased information from the media. They've come to think about this way about the Middle East because their leaders, their elected leaders, have not told them the truth, and in many cases have covered up what's really going on. They've come to think this way because there's a lot of deceptive information that various special interests and lobbying groups put forward. So the differences between what many Americans have come to think about the Middle East and what is actually happening in the Middle East are quite considerable. And so when someone like myself gets up, says what he honestly believes and has experienced, it comes across as being very provocative. We'll see. I'm going to try not to go on too long because I'd like to hear from you, and I have a feeling that rather than just lecturing to you for a long time, it would be much better to have a dialogue. We're a relatively small group. I'd like to take your questions, and I'll give you the best and most honest answers I can after these 150 trips to the region and meeting the people I have and experiencing the things that I have. Let me tell you about the peace process, because that's what most of you have been hearing for many years now, the peace process in the Middle East. And let me start by just reading you something that came across my internet desk, which is where I get most of my information these days about the Middle East, certainly not from the New York Times or the Washington Post, although there is sometimes useful information there. Let me just read you this short message from what seems to be a Palestinian American. He writes, and this is dated 10 days ago, "My father, who suffers from kidney failure and is now sleeping unconscious at his home in Jenin, is unable to leave town to an adequate hospital that can treat him. Jenin's lone hospital cannot take care of him because it does not have the equipment. He cannot leave town to enter the nearby city of Nazareth, nor to Nablus, let alone to Jerusalem. He is in a very critical situation. My uncle, who is an American citizen, contacted his representative to help. My sister, who was also an American citizen, contacted her representative, who did not bother to answer. She went to the West Bank 2 days ago to see what could be done from there. This is a tragedy for all Palestinians under the mercy of the Israeli might. My father may die for the mere reason that he cannot go to a hospital and have dialysis. No wonder Palestinians become, quote, terrorists, unquote, exclamation. By the way, my father has a green card, and that was supposed to entitle him for help from a government that bestowed such a card on him. Seeing Clinton on TV, visiting and talking about how humane the Israeli government is, made me sick. My suspicion is this is probably written by a well-educated Palestinian going to school in the United States, communicating on the internet. Obviously, he's not a terrorist. He's a very frustrated and demoralized young man. I don't know what's happened to his father. I do know that I've seen many reports in the last weeks about pregnant women trying to get to hospitals, being denied the right to go through Israeli checkpoints, literally babies dying, literally mothers dying. If we're going to be concerned about what happens to Israelis in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem, then we also have to be concerned about what happens to people in refugee camps, what happens to pregnant people trying to have babies, what happens to people who can't go to hospitals and have dialysis. It's one thing for us to come here tonight, we speak for an hour or two, we say we're concerned, and I think we all probably are concerned. It's another thing when you live day in and day out under conditions that are terribly oppressive, bringing about death, creating hate, creating anxiety, creating a new generation that is going to fight, maybe in worse ways than this generation. So I want to talk for a few moments about this peace process, which happens to be the period of time that I've personally been active, because you can really trace the current peace process back to Camp David. You can trace it back to Anwar Sadat. I was very fortunate. I was invited by the Egyptian government, having just done a book for Congressional Quarterly. I was, I think, the first Jewish journalist who was officially invited to come to Egypt. I spent 3 weeks there. And then I had an opportunity to meet with Sadat, and I arranged with him to send the first public telegram that was ever sent from the Arab world to Israel. Doesn't sound like a lot now, believe me. In those days, it was absolutely unheard of. Nobody had the slightest belief when I told them that he tells me he's going to send a telegram to Israel. However, this peace process that that we hear so much about from our president, from the media, from the various lobbying organizations, let me tell you what has really happened since my meeting with Sadat to the people of the Middle East rather than to the people of the United States. First off, right after the peace process, you had the destruction of Lebanon. You had repeated Israeli invasions, culminating in the 1982 invasion, the death of tens of thousands of innocent Palestinian women and children, the bombing of camps, the intervention of the United States, the shelling of the Lebanese mountains by the American Navy. You had the Marine barracks blown up. You had American hostages taken. Sometimes we forget all of these things. This was all part of the quote-unquote peace process that, in fact, shortly took place after the Camp David signing. You also had the Iranian Revolution. There's a huge background to the Iranian Revolution, but to make it short, we put the CIA put the Shah back on the throne after a fairly secular revolution in 1953. He repressed and tortured his opposition, and by the late 70s, the only people left were the extreme Islamic fundamentalists who then took over Iran. Shortly after they took over Iran, you'll remember Iraq attacked them. But Iraq didn't attack in a vacuum. Iraq attacked because Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United States, and Israel all encouraged the Iraqis to attack, to undo the Iranian Revolution. And then you'll remember that for a period of years we fueled both sides. Whichever side was winning, we fueled the other side to keep it going. We were even providing arms, the Iran-Contra scandal, to the Iranians when it looked like when the Iraqis were going to overrun them. This is all part of the peace process that you hear so much about. But if you're an Arab living in Iran or living in Lebanon or living in a Palestinian refugee camp, somehow it doesn't look like the same kind of peace process that our politicians tell us it is. The invasion of Lebanon led to the Sabra and Shatila massacres. I don't know how many of you remember the details of that, but let me just remind you, or tell you, that the Israelis had floodlights on buildings. They knew exactly what was taking place. They encouraged the Phalange to go into those camps and to massacre thousands and thousands of people. A lot of hatred and a lot of anxiety, a lot of misery was created, and these things don't go away just because I today am reading you about the history of the region. For the people of the region, they remember what happened to them. They remember who did it. They remember why it was done. And they understand that the so-called American peace process is for them a process in which hundreds of thousands, no, actually literally millions of people have died just in this period of time since I met Anwar Sadat and this peace process began. But it's not just that. You've got revolution from Algeria all the way to Pakistan these days. And, well, I told you, the story I have to tell you tonight is a very serious story. It's a story of repression, and it's a story of death and misery, and it's a story that we Americans should be concerned about because we are not innocent observers. Our government portrays us as people interested in promoting human rights and promoting democracy and promoting peace, except that most people in the region understand that the United States is completely hypocritical. The United States supports the most repressive dictators in the region. The United States supports the most repressive royal families in the region. The United States supplies $4 billion, almost $4 billion a year to Israel. And Israel has in fact repressed the Palestinian people for over a generation. We'll get to the current peace process, the most recent manifestation, which began on the White House lawn with Rabin and Arafat in a few minutes. But unless I give you this background, unless I sort of set the stage for discussing the last few years, I don't think you'll fully understand the gravity of the situation that we face in the region. In Algeria, on the west, you had elections. Those elections, family-oriented people, not that much different than us. They have a different religion, but it's a religion of the book. They consider all Christians and Jews to be part of Islamic tradition. That's Algeria. You move from Algeria, you've got Libya. We've had sanctions on Libya for a long time now. Many Americans forget that we also sent bombers to bomb Libya. We also bombed the presidential palace in Libya. We killed relatives of the current president of Libya. Some people think that the Pan Am crisis over Lockerbie, Scotland, was revenge on the part of the Libyans. I don't know. I don't know if it was Syrians or Palestinians or Libyans, but I do know that it wouldn't be that unusual in a situation where one country has bombed and attempted to kill the leader of another country, that country might do something by way of revenge. In Egypt, you have a situation where it's pretty much a police state. The president of the country is a former general. He's dressed up in a nice Seville suit. I've met him a number of times. He's not the most thoughtful man, not the most interesting man I've ever met, but he does his job well. He comes out, he says what needs to be said. There have been a number of assassination attempts. Tens of thousands of Egyptians are in jail, and the country is in sort of a pre-revolutionary phase. The current leadership is kept in power largely because the CIA and American military provide the intelligence capability and the repressive capabilities to keep that regime in power. The same is true pretty much in the Gulf. The same is true in Saudi Arabia. If you'll remember, it was just last year, in fact, that the National Guard barracks in Riyadh were blown up. Well, what is the Saudi National Guard? The Saudi National Guard is the Praetorian Guard of the Saudi royal family, trained by the United States. Its job is to make sure that the people of Saudi Arabia don't have a democratic government and don't overthrow the royal family. The royal family itself is corrupt and despotic. The stories of King Fahad's life in Beirut before he became king are legend. Which brings us, without going into the details of places like Bahrain and Kuwait, and by the way, right today, as we speak, I don't know how many of you know there's a near revolution in Bahrain, and a likelihood that American military forces will intervene on the pretext, which is not true, that it's an Iranian-sponsored revolution. These are reports I got in Washington just before I left. I don't even know if they're into the American newspaper yet. So, with all that gloomy news, what about the Arab-Israeli peace process? And what about what's been going on for the past few years? And why shouldn't we be hopeful? And why shouldn't I take a much more positive attitude? After all, I'm Jewish, and don't I support Israel? And don't I think that at least there's hope after the events of the past couple of years? Well, I have a whole packet full of quotes from experts. people like Professor Edward Said at Columbia University, people like Noam Chomsky at MIT, professors in Palestine, Israeli journalists, people who gave the keynote speech at the Middle East Institute. I haven't got time to read you the quotes. Each one is more negative than the other. The difference between what the experts are saying to each other and writing in journals and what you're told on the evening news and by the President of the United States and by various officials from the Arab countries is mind-boggling. It's like you're talking about two totally different realities. Let me just give you a couple of examples. The White House ceremony, 1993. The ceremony where we were told there was this huge, unbelievable breakthrough, and Rabin and Arafat were shaking hands, and everything was going to change, and peace was around the corner, and America should give more money to both parties. What they didn't tell you, just one fact, but it's a very symbolic fact. They didn't tell you that the very man who had been the head of the Palestinian negotiating team, the very man who had sat in Madrid at the conference as the representative of Palestine and read before the world the position of the Palestinians, wasn't at the ceremony. He refused to come to the ceremony. Now, I was on that day speaking to Canadian national television, and I was providing the commentary for the Canadian national audience. And I checked this to the best of my ability. Not one single commentator on American media ever told the American public that there's something not quite right here. On the one hand, they tell us this is such a major breakthrough and it's going to lead to a stable peace. But on the other hand, even the head of the negotiating team for the Palestinians refused to come to the ceremony and legitimize what he thought to be a complete sellout and a complete surrender. Now, I know that most Americans are primarily interested in the Arab-Israeli issue. I believe there are some Jewish people here tonight, but there are also some Jewish people in this community that aren't here tonight. And apparently they're not here because they feel that this is an unfair situation, that someone like myself should address you and mention things that they don't want you to know. That's basically what's involved here. They just don't want you to know. They don't want you to think about these things. They don't want you to hear that not only is there another side to these things, but in my experience, the best experts in the world, the people that are most acclaimed in the academic journals, the people that have the most books out, the people that are that get the biggest audiences at universities all around the country, Edward Said and Noam Chomsky among them, they completely endorse the kinds of things that I'm telling you. Actually, I endorse what they're telling the world. And they're doing so also not in forums where you get to hear them. When McNeil Lehrer does reports on the Middle East, you never hear from, that's not true. Every once in a while, they do invite Edward Said, and once in 20 years, they invited Noam Chomsky. But they normally invite a very narrow range of people who are pretty much State Department approved type people. In fact, the joke we have in Washington is that if the current Republican Congress takes away the funding from PBS, the poor State Department's going to have to ask for an extra allocation because the State Department is going to have to fund McNeil Lehrer, which is pretty much State Department television. The unfairness is to you. The unfairness is to you out here in the heartland who pay your taxes, who believe in American values, who believe in human rights, who believe in democracy, who believe in justice, and who believe, unfortunately, in my view, our political leaders when they tell us that our policies are in favor of human rights, that our policies are promoting justice, that our policies are leading to a stable peace. That's not my experience. And my brief rendition of what's happened since 1978 in Camp David, the wars, the revolutions, the rise of Hamas. Let's talk about the Palestinians for just a few moments. Where did Hamas come from? There was no Hamas when I first started visiting the Middle East. Hamas was initially a creation of the Israelis themselves, because at the time their policy was to divide the PLO, to delegitimize the PLO. There were Islamic nationalists who knew that the PLO was corrupt, who didn't approve of the secular and squandering policies of the PLO. And the Israelis themselves, in the early days, pushed forward Hamas in order to further divide the Palestinians from themselves. Whatever one thinks of Hamas, 95% of its activities are orphanages, schools, welfare programs. I'm not fronting for them. I don't even know them. I occasionally have met a few. I'm a secular Jewish existentialist. I have no theological overlap with the Hamas people. The Hamas people. But when I have met with them, I have often found, and it's almost always been by accident, I have often found them to be extremely thoughtful, very articulate, extremely committed, far less corrupt than the PLO counterparts. And even the current situation, the bombings and the terrorism of the last couple of months. How many of you remember, or how many of you hear being told, that one of the reasons this is happening is the Israelis arrested the head of Hamas years ago?
I'm Mark Bruzonsky, your host for this weekly program, Mideast Realities, and thank you for watching. If you too are concerned about the situation in today's Middle East and about U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world, and if you'd like to meet like-minded persons, why don't you come to one of our weekly social meetings? I'll be there, of course. Just give us a call for details.